Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome to another episode of Sree's daily global COVID-19 show. In this series, we discuss three crises: the health, economy, and race crises around the world. We're always looking for guests and theme suggestions, so please email them to sree@sree.net. My name is Sree Sreenivasan, and it is my honor to host this daily conversation. We're so grateful that all of you are with us, especially those of us who join us on the replay. Please share this with your friends and family around the world right now. We are live on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter, and on LinkedIn. Tag a friend. We have a very special episode for you tonight. Meet Michele Goodwin. Professor Goodwin is at Michele B. Goodwin and michelebgoodwin.com. She's the author of Policing the Womb and host of the brand new podcast for Ms. Magazine, On the Issues. We look forward to talking to her in just a few minutes. We are going to give you a chance to tag all your friends, and then we will bring her on. So she'll join us in just a couple of minutes. Thank you all for being here. I'm Sree, and I'm the Marshall Loeb Visiting Professor of Digital Innovation at Stony Brook School of Journalism and the co-founder of Digimentors, a social, digital, and virtual events consulting company. Thank you for being here. For everyone who's written in saying that this is a lifeline for you, that this show is something that helps you, I want to say thank you and say this helps me. This is my lifeline, and that's why we do this every single day. This is episode 118. That means we've been on lockdown for 118 days in New York City, and we've been live 118 days, only possible because of the incredible support of almost 1 million plus people who have seen this show around the world, as well as the folks who have been our guests. More than 200 guests have been on this show from more than a dozen countries. We're also grateful to our producers, Rose Horowitz at Rose Horowitz 31 and at Vandana Menon, Vandana_Menon. Because of them, they've been working 118 days. We're able to bring you the show. We're also grateful to Scroll.in, one of India's leading news, information, culture, and analysis websites. Please check them out at Scroll.in. And finally, we're so grateful to our sponsors. So we will start there by thanking our sponsors, and then you'll meet Professor Goodwin in just a few minutes. Let's start with Rutgers University and globalentrepreneurshipexperience.org. Take a screenshot or take a photograph so you can share it. This is a virtual teen camp. Learn from entrepreneurs and startup experts from around the world, including Cognizant, Google, Facebook, Angie's List, and get 20% off with the code SREE. So please check this out, globalentrepreneurshipexperience.org. I'm making sure that all of you are sharing this with your friends and family on all the networks. And if you're watching right now, please make sure you are hitting retweet on Facebook or retweet on Twitter, of course, and all the other channels. We have a couple of more sponsors we want to thank. We want to thank Muckrack for Fundamentals of Social Media. This is a course they have allowed me and helped me to create. It's a free certification course. Someone you know or everyone you know in the world can participate. More than 4,000 people have signed up for mrac.co/social. Please check it out, and you get a certificate for about 2 hours of material. You can do it in 2 hours or 2 days or 2 months. mrac.co/social. We also want to thank the folks who are bringing you She's on Call, and a show that I'm honored to executive produce. And here is some information about that show.
Hi, I'm Dr. Sujana Chandrasekhar. I'm an ear, nose, and throat surgeon in New York City and New Jersey.
And I'm Dr. Marina Kurian. I'm a general surgeon in New York City area.
We'd like to introduce you to our new show, She's on Call. We air live on social media platforms from 11 a.m. to noon every Sunday Eastern Time. We discuss the medical topics of the week.
We have two great guests, experts in their field, that help us analyze and look at some of the topical issues of healthcare. And we are on 11 to 12, so please join us.
We'd love to answer your questions. So please share and watch and send us your questions and comments.
See you Sundays at 11.
Make sure you follow @She's on Call on Facebook and Twitter. And with that, we want to remind you of our guest today. Michele Goodwin is our guest. She is author of Policing the Womb. She's the host of the brand new podcast On the Issues. And before we bring her on, I will just tell you a little bit more about her so that we don't embarrass her when she is on screen with us. She's an award-winning author, advocate, professor, and social commentator. She has done so many things that we cannot fit this into our announcement now, into these few minutes. But her scholarship has been hailed as exceptional in the New England Journal of Medicine. She's been featured in everything from Politico to Forbes to HBO's Vice News, and of course now Ms. Magazine. She's a prolific author, and she's been published in the Yale Law Journal, Harvard Law Journal, the NYU Law Review, the California Law Review. Her publications include 5 books and over 80 articles, essays, book chapters, as well as numerous commentaries. Trained in sociology and anthropology, she has conducted field research in Asia, Africa, Europe, North America, focusing on trafficking in the human body for marriage, sex, organs, and other biologics. In addition to her work on reproductive health, rights, and justice, she's credited with forging new ways of thinking in organ transplant policy and assisted reproductive technologies, resulting in work such as black markets, the supply and demand of body parts, and baby markets, money, and the politics of creating families. She's at the forefront of national and international health policy discourse, and she's a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and the medical community on issues in organ donor intervention. And that's just the start. Let's bring her on, because otherwise the entire episode would be just me singing her praises without her being on camera. So let's bring her on camera and have her here with us. Hello.
Hello. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you for being here. And we could have just kept going on and on and on. We're so honored that you would spend some time with us tonight here. We are in New York. I'm in New York. You are not. So tell us where you are and how you're doing. That's my first question to every guest we have.
So right now I'm in California and I'm doing well here, but I'm very mindful about the stressors around the world, including in California. Not everybody is able to shelter in place with security. And I understand that that has significant health and also psychological health implications. So while I am doing fine, meditating, appreciating my yoga and so much more, I realize also that's a privileged position that others are perhaps not able to share. But we globally do share the risk that COVID presents. And so thank you for doing the show.
No, thank you very much. We appreciate that. There's just so much going on, but we want to start by asking you about your brand new show.
Yes, well, thank you so much for that. On the Issues with Michele Goodwin, launched with Ms. Magazine during COVID. So our first episode aired a week ago, and I'm really excited about the episode that launches next week. We taped it today, and I'm happy to share here, your listeners and viewers get to know that Senator Carol Moseley Braun and also Congresswoman Katie Porter are on our next episode, which focuses on rebuilding America from the ground up. And I was particularly pleased to bring them on, given how unbought and unbossed they are, channeling a bit of Shirley Chisholm. It's very interesting, given the backdrop of what's happening around the world in terms of talk about social justice and racial justice, when Senator Carol Moseley Braun, who's also an ambassador, when she came into the Senate, she was the second African-American in the entire century of the 20th century to be in the Senate. There were only 2 in the entire last 100 years of 2000, of the 20th century, the 1900s. There were only 2 African-Americans in the Senate. Kamala Harris and Cory Booker now are 2 more. And then Katie Porter, who's been so indefatigable and clear-headed about thinking about the economy single parent families, and how we rebuild and do justice by people vis-a-vis banks. It's just been extraordinary. So thank you for asking about the show. It's a show where we report, rebel, and we say, tell it like it is.
So we're just looking at this here. This was the announcement, I guess, at Ms. Magazine. And shall we play a little bit of this video here so that people
Sure.
can, if we can do that? Is this a sizzle reel type or a trailer?
Let's sizzle it on. Absolutely.
All right. Let's hear it. Oops, let's see here. Sorry, 1 second. Sorry, 1 second. Wow, that looks great. So now we just need to get the audio working. Hold on 1 second. Yeah, here we go. That should be ready. And again.
Friends, join me for a new podcast on the issues with Michele Goodwin at Ms. Magazine. Of our times. That's going to include activists, politicians, scholars, and others who care about the issues and who are qualified to talk about the issues. Now, on this podcast, throughout the time that we do it, we will be reclaiming our time. And I want you to join us for our first podcast on June 30th, 2020. You can find us at msmagazine.com, on Apple Podcast, on Spotify, and also on Stitcher. Join us for a podcast that you will not want to miss.
Wow, that's how you sell a podcast. That is awesome.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So tell us about the relationship with Ms. Magazine, the partnership. How does that work? How did that come together? And how did you decide that this is the right next big project for you?
So over time, I've been encouraged to do so, but the right moment didn't occur until now. But I can tell you about Ms. Magazine and the Feminist Majority Foundation. And these are organizations that work in combination. Ms. Magazine is housed at the Feminist Majority Foundation in Los Angeles. And it's an organization which has opened its arm to many organizations that seek to elevate the concerns that I care about, social justice, equal rights, women's health, and so much more. And so over the last 5 or 6 years since I've been in California, I've done many events at the Feminist Majority Foundation. Very recently hosted events there on maternal mortality, which is a very significant issue in the United States. The United States leads the developed world, with air quotes I'll put around that, in terms of maternal health and safety. The United States ranks around 50th in the world in terms of keeping pregnant people, women alive during their pregnancies. It's actually safer to give birth in places like Bosnia and Saudi Arabia than in the United States. Not to digress, but Texas, Louisiana, these are considered the deadliest places in the developed world for a pregnant woman. So partnering with Ms. Magazine and the Feminist Majority Foundation has been something far larger than just this project. It has been bringing important critical insights to broader communities, whether we're talking about maternal mortality, thinking about how we handle gun control in the United States, matters involving reproductive health and rights, such as this Trump administration rolling back on protections that had been in place since Nixon's time as president, and so much more. So this became a kind of natural next step. I write for Ms. quite a bit, and it's been just a pleasure to work with them and the various communities that they represent. It's terrific. And let me add one other point to that. which is that in a time in which we are thinking about the breadth of journalism and thinking about how journalism and editors lift up a broader point of view with regard to culture, politics, the economy, and so much more, I want to be clear that Ms. Magazine has been doing an extraordinary job with regard to amplifying various voices. And we know when we amplify the multitude of voices, we actually do much better for our nation and our world. And so I commend Ms. Magazine, apart from my involvement with them, for doing that hard and important work, which means being introspective, and it means not just settling for the status quo, but to actually challenge itself to think about views in a broad perspective. And so that's been great, and it's been wonderful to align and to get into this new space of podcasting.
So speaking of spaces, let's talk about Twitter. And you're on there as Michele B. Goodwin. We want everybody to follow you. And I love looking at people's Twitters because they really tell us who they are, right, in the bio. And here, law professor, executive committee member of the ACLU, author, advocate, host on the issues with Michele Goodwin at Ms. Magazine. Break that down a little bit. How does one human being do all of these things and do them all so well?
Well, I appreciate that so much. And again, thank you for having me on the show and the various voices that you've been lifting up. Let me just say this. You and I probably both know many women, our foremothers, who put us to shame. It is true that I work hard, and there are nights in which I work deep into the long evening, let us say. But I also recognize that what I do in many ways pales in comparison to those who came before me. And I realize, and I take that quite seriously. I've spent a lot of time in recent years, and also longer, but been really in recent years it's really shined quite brightly for me the importance of actually recognizing people like Fannie Lou Hamers, the Ida B. Well, so many, a laundry list of women who woke up early, went to bed late at night, doing the real important heavy lifting for our country, making everything that our Constitution proposes to come real. And so I say that in thinking about the first that you described, which is that I am a professor. And so I am a professor with a chair-chancellor's professorship at the University of California, Irvine. My main faculty home is in the law school, but I also have faculty appointments across about 5 or 6 different other departments, which is pretty consistent with where I was before at the University of Minnesota. I had an endowed chair there, and also as a professor in the medical school and School of Public Health. And so it's wonderful being here in California. I've been making my way west, it appears. I also serve on the executive committee of the National ACLU. It's an organization that is very dear to my heart. I think if one put an equal sign across from my photo, it would be the ACLU, or if you put up the ACLU and you put an equal sign, and on the other side would be my headshot. It's an organization that stands in the space of upholding civil liberties and civil rights. It's an organization that has stood even when others may not stand on certain issues. And this has been across the board. There are many social justice and issues that are not necessarily considered social justice where the ACLU has been involved for a very long time. It's an organization that has been understood as a First Amendment organization, but it's so much more than that. You know, the ACLU was key in the Korematsu decision. And although the ACLU has seen its losses, on that side it was a loss, but standing for the principles of what is right and what is fair, and what our Constitution stands for is the nature, is the soul and the spirit of the ACLU. And so from being on the right side of history, even when losing in a case like Korematsu, to actually winning in a case like Loving v. Virginia, a case that challenged anti-miscegenation laws across the country. There were states that forbade people of color from being married to white people and vice versa. And the ACLU stood against that. So yes, a professor, member of the ACLU, an executive committee member, and a person who writes a lot. So that's the person that you have on your show tonight.
Well, and we're so lucky. In a few minutes, I'm going to ask Rose Horowitz, one of our producers, to join us and talk a little bit to you along with me and ask a few more questions. But before that, we do something called a global tour where we have people around the world watching, saying hello to you. So what we'll do is we'll name some places where they are. If you've been there or you've had a meal there or it's on your bucket list, any of those things work. And it's a lot of fun. I should tell you that Will Sutton, who was our guest earlier in one of our episodes, said, don't call it bucket list, call it life list, right? Like that's his, because he said bucket list means, you know, that there's an ending there that he didn't want to contemplate. So let's just start. Jonathan Borstein is watching from Union Square, which trended today on Twitter as one of the 3 worst places in New York City. So presume you've been to Union Square, but what would you say are the 3 worst places in New York City, or one worst place or best place? You pick.
Oh my gosh. Well, why don't I pick a best pick, and I'll think about Serendipity, a little dessert shop in New York City.
Oh, I love it. Yes. Yes. So tell us why you like it. It's just a great, unusual place.
So yeah, and of course then the Ziegfeld Theater. If you get me started, I'll go down the list.
Let's go.
Yeah. So I grew up in New York. I was born in Wisconsin. I grew up in New York. And, you know, New York was such a dynamic place. It continues to be a dynamic place, but it's also changed. You know, New York was a place where people could come with a hunger and a dream and try to make that dream. And what's changed is that New York is so unaffordable. And so it doesn't resemble the New York of so many years before, where that kind of passion could in fact materialize into something quite substantive, you know, with apartments that are being sold for $140 million and so much more. Some of this just seems absolutely absurdist. But we were talking about dessert, and we were talking about serendipity. And I think any child who's had the opportunity, or adult, to be there and enjoy the dessert there is in for a terrific surprise. But New York, the museums are wonderful. You know, part of the daily that I had as a child, or the weekly, was in fact going to the museums in New York, being able to visit and spend time in Central Park. In fact, one of the schools that I attended, because real estate is in fact so thin in some ways in New York, our recess was in Central Park, and it was just wonderful. That's when I attended the Rudolph Steiner School. So
oh yeah, sure, big school.
Yeah, exactly. But I have to say too, you know, all of these places, we think about them with also nuance. So when I think about Central Park, I think about the beauty in the park and the little place where people do their electric little boats and whatnot. But it's also a place where the statue of Marion Sims had to come down. So as I think about it with my multiple hats, you know, Marion Sims did horrific experimentations, really torture, on Black women. During antebellum times, he would rent Black women and then have what he described in his autobiography as epiphanies in the middle of the night. And these epiphanies led him then to rousing the Black women that he kept enslaved at his home, and he would cut into them, lacerate, provide no anesthesia, all of this. So, you know, when one thinks about New York and Central Park, you get the nuance of America, and it's important to wed both. It's important to acknowledge the challenges of the spaces in which we are in, as well as their beauty. And I think that we can live with both. I find the challenges of these times are that we're supposed to forget and fail to acknowledge those types of things that do not deserve us well. And I think that we do much better for ourselves by saying we can acknowledge that, and yet we can pivot to the future and create the silver linings that we want to live.
Thank you. And folks, you see what a great conversation this is. Please tag your friends. Please hit share. Please retweet. We're live on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn right now. And your friends can watch live or later. So let's keep going. Paul is watching from Tallahassee, Florida. Have you been?
I have been to Tallahassee, Florida, yes, some time ago, but I've given a talk in Tallahassee, Florida, and that might have been nearly 20 years ago. So yes, I have.
Terrific. I just want to say that Paula is part of our production team, and we do another show called Sree's New York Times Read Along, where we read the New York Times out loud like crazy people. For 5 years, we've been doing it. And our most recent guest, day before yesterday, was Trish Hall, former editor of the New York Times op-ed page. So anybody who wants to find it can go into my archives, youtube.com/Sreenet, and watch that. Her book is called How to Persuade, Writing to Persuade. So you do a lot of that, writing and now speaking, and of course on your show. What is a secret on your, what is a secret you have to get people to listen to you, to bring them over to your side?
That's a very good question. Here's one thing. It's really important to be prepared, and it's also very important to read. Reading is fundamental. Whoever came up with that had something very brilliant, right? But when we're prepared, when we're well-read, people may disagree. I don't mind people disagreeing with me, but when we can lay it all out there, that gives us then room to pick from there. It gives us a foundation, a starting point. So I think preparation is really important. And years ago, I worked in Kentucky to help in the historic discrimination in schools there, and to help with the implementation of Brown v. Board of Education so long after the opinion had been decided by the Supreme Court. And I learned something in that space, which was that if the ultimate goal was to help the school districts that I was involved with be able to reach this plateau of ending discrimination, of recognizing its implicit and explicit biases and so forth, I needed to meet people where they were and then build from there. And it was a critical insight that I was able to gain, and not on my own, but really by listening to other people. And I find it to be so incredibly important, keeping in mind what our ultimate goals and objectives happen to be, never compromising our integrity, and listening is critically important, and showing compassion for people. I think this is probably a good time to talk about the values that guide me, and I think that they are what guide conversations that I'm in. I very much believe in the value of perseverance, the value of accountability, integrity, and dignity. And I would add to that compassion and empathy are really critical. And I think that these are some of the values that I would like to think that my ancestors carried with them.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think you've inspired many, many people. Anand's watching from Andhra Pradesh, India.
Oh my gosh. Well, I've been to India several times, and I have not been
Hyderabad. Roughly where have you been?
Oh, well, Hyderabad, Patna, Pune, Mumbai, Delhi. I'm all over the place. Yeah, okay. Bihar, one of the scariest places I've ever been in my life. But I have been all over India, yes, doing quite a bit of field research there. And yes, beautiful. And again, a place of so many dynamics, right? The multitude of them. And so in Bihar, I've done field research on marriage trafficking, the sex trafficking of young girls. In Bihar, it's known for underage marriage. Sometimes judges are even complicit in this. And part of that has been describing India's laws as there's the federal law of Delhi, as people have often told me, and then there's the cultural law. And sometimes the cultural law is seen as more important than the federal law. And so in Bihar, heartbreaking instances of meeting families and meeting girls, interviewing girls who are barely 13 or 14 on their second marriage because the first husband died. And terrible illiteracy, mothers who are disappointed with themselves because they didn't insist that their daughters went to school or go to school. But at the same time, mothers who are caught in their own shackles and worrying about their daughters going to school and potentially being abused, harassed, assaulted, or raped. Really challenging issues. And at the same time, seeing sometimes the challenges and failures of government that may think that so long as something is written in a book or in a pamphlet that it solves the problem, when in fact it really doesn't.
Thank you. And I made my first trip to Bihar just this past January. And it's a place, like in many places in the world, which has so much potential, so many great people, but also problems that come with poverty at the root of everything. Isn't that what we see everywhere we go in the world where there are such issues, including New York City? Right?
Including New York City. And then there's
or maybe especially New York City.
Or especially New York City, right? But then there's Pune, right? And there's such a rich history all throughout all of India. You know, you go to southern India and then suddenly you find yourself in a space where the literacy rate is higher than it is in the United States, right? The rate of people obtaining a college education as being higher, right? And so that is why it's really so important to understand with nuance the diversity of what a place happens to be, and to understand what it is that creates the dynamics that people are in. I think one of the mistakes that we make in the world is if we see people and we say that this is all they'll ever be, and this is all they were before, and failing to understand what colonialism means to global democracy, understanding what histories of Jim Crow and slavery mean to democracies. And for so long, there's been a short shrift to understanding what these institutionalized patterns of oppression mean, but they are real. And if we were to think about this within the family context, we'd see it so much more brightly. If you imagined a family where there are 5 children and 2 of the children are treated to everything wonderful, right? They get great schooling and education. They get to go to boarding schools if they want to. They get all of the sports and activities and drama and theater and all of the things that they could possibly want, and everything is paved the way. There's a trust fund for them, and there it all is. And the other kids are deprived at different, to different degrees. Well, we would see in that family, we would say, how unfair of the parents to do that. And we would understand that as those children left that family in order to build their own families, that the 2 that were provided everything had such a leg up to do so much better. We would find it unfair to criticize those that never had what the other 2 did. Now, that's a simplistic example, but I think sometimes we have to drill down to the simple and obvious in order to begin thinking about larger global issues.
Totally agree. Ashok says, welcome to Kerala. Anytime you'd like to go to the state of Kerala, where my parents are watching, and they live there. Manisha says, hello from Delhi. It's a pleasure to listen to shows like this first thing in the morning, because of course it's very early there. Jonathan, by the way, from Union Square says, I'm being priced out of the city I was born and brought up in, and this is the story of so many people. Apollo is watching in Vegas. Do you have any stories from Vegas that you're allowed to share?
Well, I've only been to Las Vegas 2 times, in the most recent case, time to celebrate a friend's birthday and to attend a concert. So not much in terms of anything exciting about Las Vegas. I wish there was less smoking in Las Vegas. It's hard to stay virtually anywhere in Las Vegas and not walk through plumes of smoke. I have to say I'm very grateful for living in my town where there is no outdoor smoking.
Oh, at all? Even outdoor smoking?
No, not. Right. Well, to think about it, we're in California, and we need to be mindful about the drought, and we also have to be mindful about earthquakes and fires. And so it's actually very smart to ban smoking. In a city, it's not good for us. And the second thing is that, sadly, even though we've done so much better with environmentalism, it doesn't hit home for everybody. And people toss cigarettes out of their windows. It's interesting living in a city where it is a town. We like to call ourselves, it's a beach town. And people come to the beach town in order to enjoy it. And that's great, because it means that we have, those of us who live in town have even more restaurants and things like that we can enjoy because the tourists come in. But at the same time, what one notices too is that people come in for beauty, but it's important to preserve that beauty. And so in banning cigarette smoking, it means likely our beaches are not, are free of a lot of litter that otherwise would be. It also means that our parks are also less vulnerable, right, to fires being started and so much more. And so, yeah.
Apollo says listening, compassion are the seeds of seeds for learning, and we should always, as Americans, be open to the world. The gaps between custom and law mirrors the gap between the ideals of the law and actual practice. And he said this is very illuminating. He says so illuminating. So that's great. Rajendran says poverty sometimes is a function of inequity, and we've certainly seen that. Rose, who's going to join us in a minute, is tagging all her friends. Everybody, please do that. This is such a great conversation. I'm learning a lot. And Mark is watching from Durham, North Carolina. Have you been?
I have been to Durham, North Carolina. I have given talks at the University of North Carolina and also at Duke University. So I have been there. The last time I was there was probably maybe 7 or 8 years ago, maybe a little bit longer than that. Yeah.
When is the last time you were on a plane?
Last time that I was on a plane was March right before COVID, so it would have been maybe March the 4th, 3rd or 4th.
Because everything shut down 10 days later.
Shut down. In fact, I was supposed to be the first week of COVID, I was supposed to be heading to Chicago. After Chicago, heading to New York for 2 events, and then on to Paris, then on to the Netherlands, and then back to the United States, and then back to Paris, and on to Italy, and so forth. But I'm here, so I'm in California. So this is what happens during COVID. I'm not on a plane, but there are people who are braving it.
And there are, but you also now have time to do the podcast, so that's great.
This is true.
Mark is a member of the ACLU and asks, do you know Tula Connell, an activist in the labor movement? And he's talking about a bunch of folks. He says, I'm a big fan of Polly Murray, who had the spirit, and Nora Zeal Hurston. And yes, I remember my grandmother on my mom's side being up early working as a cafeteria worker.
This is what I'm saying. You know, there are histories of people that we don't recognize. So with all due respect to the wonderful jurist, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who serves on our Supreme Court, who has been phenomenal and indefatigable. Before Ruth Bader Ginsburg, there was Polly Murray, a Black woman who graduated first in her class, who was at the ACLU before Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a bit of a mentor, not only for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but everybody else at the ACLU, and who laid the foundation for even the Supreme Court case last week that came out, Bostock case, that now states that there cannot be discrimination against LGBTQ people in employment. Well, the very notion of thinking about equality and equality of opportunity in employment was thought of decades ago. In 1945, Polly Murray published a law review article in the California Law Review about the importance of equality of opportunity, and anti-discrimination in employment. 1945, a Black woman did that. It's 2020 that the Supreme Court is catching on. So this is why it really is so important to, in my opinion, lift up the important legacies of our foremothers, because they were teaching us. There were some that were listening and many others that were not, but I feel something visceral in me when I watch the videos of people in Birmingham, Alabama, in Mississippi, who put everything on the line, their farms, their homes, to help subsidize the litigation that would lead to the victories that would make us a better country. You know, when people think about it today, you know, there were no Bill Gates that were behind supporting cases like Brown v. Board of Education and so much more. That was everyday folk who gave everything. And let's be clear, this was in hostile situations. That is to say, every time there were Black people who had farms or who had businesses and said, no, I'm going to give some money for this important litigation, they were threatened. Sometimes their lives were physically threatened. They experienced economic threats, and yet they persisted. And when I see the videos of children, 7, 8, 9 years old, being pushed into paddy wagons because their parents are allowing them out to demonstrate something that holds up our Constitution and says, is this what the Constitution means when you deny these children an education? those people who fought so hard and bravely to help our Constitution come alive, they deserve to be remembered. And that is a personal and professional mission of mine.
Thank you so much for sharing. Apollo says, awesomeness, Polly Murray. Mark is linking to the savingplaces.org website about Polly Murray House. And I want to say that I'm ashamed to say I hadn't heard of her. And now it's on my list now to read about her. We also showed a New Yorker article that said, how come you've never heard of her? Almost talking to me, but to millions of other people. So I love what you said, our foremothers, and how do we bring attention to that, to them in so many ways. We know that the New York Times is trying to do its best by doing those obits of overlooked women and minorities. That's a start. But I'm so grateful that we had this conversation just for this, right? She was a lawyer, women's rights activist, Episcopal priest, the first African-American woman to be ordained a priest in the first year that any women were ordained by that church. So and she was born in Baltimore. She was an orphan, and she was raised in Durham, North Carolina. So all of this comes together in this conversation. Folks, please share this so your friends can listen to Michele Goodwin, but we also want you to take a look at her podcast and subscribe to it on Apple, Stitcher, whatever your favorite podcasting tools are.
Exactly, all of those platforms. And this is such an important conversation to have. And if I could give one more example, and there could be so many across cultures, right? So Fannie Lou Hamer. So we think about the importance of the right to vote, right? Really, really important. And we see the right to vote expressed in our Constitution. But when does it become real? You see foremothers like Fannie Lou Hamer, as she described the experience that she had in Mississippi. And let's be clear, so in Mississippi, one of the ways to suppress the vote, or early on, were poll taxes, right? So you have to, have a certain income to vote, and then you have to pay to be able to vote. But all of these things were ways of keeping certain people away from the vote, largely people of color and the poor. Well, in the 1950s and the 1960s, as Black people were activating to be able to vote, many were being arrested. And Fannie Lou Hamer describes being arrested one day as she was trying to vote. And voting itself was no guarantee. If you were Black, you had to guess how many bubbles on a bar of soap, how many jelly beans in a jar, just absurdist kinds of things. But she describes how she was taken into a jail, and the patrol officer who had arrested her because she was trying to vote gave the baton to a man in the prison who was a prisoner and told him to beat her. And after that man was exhausted, he gave the baton to another man to beat her. Now, Fannie Lou Hamer had suffered polio as a child, and so as she tried to protect the leg that had been harmed by polio, the officer was not moved and beat her there, and then beat her on her head. Now, the tragedy behind this also has an important silver lining, which is that when Fannie Lou Hamer wanted to tell this story at the Democratic National Convention in 1964, I believe it was, she didn't have the floor. And the person who had the floor and had the mic was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And you know what he did? This is what it means to be an ally and advocate. He gave her the microphone. That is really doing something. Both Fannie Lou Hamer telling the story of what was really happening on the ground in parts of the South and specifically in Mississippi, but more importantly, Dr. King recognizing that he had the privilege of his position and people listening to him, and that he could yield his time, share the floor with this woman so that she could lift up other stories. And I find all of that so profound and so wonderful. And her legacy is important to think about when we elevate voting rights.
Thank you very much for sharing that. I'm going to now bring Rose Horowitz on the screen here with us. And we're also going to show everyone a lovely profile she did on her Women to Follow hashtag and on Medium. So let's bring her on. Hi, Rose.
Hi.
How are you?
Great to be here. Hi, Michelle.
Hi there. Good to see you, Rose.
Yeah, nice to see you. We actually, when we did that Medium, I think it was 10 o'clock here and 7 o'clock California time. And I said, okay, we're ready to do StreamYard. And Michelle said, oh, okay, audio. And I said, no, this is also on camera. And she said, oh, well, no, it's 7 a.m. here. So anyway, but so great to see you on camera.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. That is one of the East Coast, West Coast challenges. 10 o'clock is well into the morning and day in New York. It's 7 a.m. in California. But we pivot and we adjust.
You just published this article. Michele Goodwin hopes her book, Policing the Womb, will spark outrage. And this is your hashtag Women to Follow profile, your 16th profile that you've done, and it's of Michele. So let's get into the quick conversation. I know Michele has, I'm sure, has dinner and other plans, but we have so many comments and so many questions coming in, Michele. Thank you so much for your patience. Go ahead, Rose.
Okay. This book came out on March 12th, I think. So it was right as we were going into lockdown. I think in New York City, it was March 13th or when we started the show. So how have you gotten the message out about this book, and tell us what, and I've seen you on various webinars, but I'm sure you had
it's been a lot of webinars. So,
yeah.
We pivot. And I think that's also the lesson of the past. You learn how to make wonderful lemon meringue and lemonade out of the lemons of COVID. And so what's been important is thinking through in times of COVID, how the messaging of the book still, how it relates, and it relates quite significantly. One of the first deaths in a U.S. Federal prison was of an Indigenous woman who was pregnant. Her baby was delivered by C-section and then she died. The book itself talks about the ratcheting up of the surveillance of women and their pregnancies. And so it seeks to move beyond abortion, which is an important point and conversation for us to have, particularly given that a person is 14 times more likely by carrying a pregnancy to term than terminating it. And that's really important to know, including the US maternal mortality rate, which I've talked about before. But it's also important to understand the criminalization of pregnancy itself and motherhood, which goes under the radar, which is why it's really important to diversify those in editorial rooms and the journalists so that we can actually have coverage of these issues. There are women across the country that have been criminally prosecuted because a prosecutor doesn't like their behavior during their pregnancy. I have interviewed prosecutors who've told me, well, that their motivations are all driven by their religious interests and not about the law. And so it's really important to elevate what's happening across the country in multiple variants of thinking about reproductive health rights and justice.
Can you tell us about the case, I think it was in Florida that we spoke about, where where the judge was ordering the woman out of the house because she wanted to give, because she was late. She was late.
Yeah, it's the case of Lisa Epstein. So it was her doctor. So it was a case of, this is where I say that women of color have been the canaries in the coal mine in the 1980s and 90s when no one was paying attention to the very rough, egregious, unconstitutional behavior directed at them during their pregnancies, being dragged out of hospitals in shackles and chains, giving birth in prison toilets and on prison floors. Really significant horrors. But now what this means is that because those precedents and practices have been in place, there are middle-class white women that are being threatened with arrest because they don't want a C-section, because they would like an extra couple days to see if they can have a natural birth. That was the case of Lisa Epstein, who is a mother of 4 or 5 children, and so just wanted to wait an extra couple days and received a letter from her doctor threatening to call police to drag her out of her home if she refused to come in that day and surrender to him and a C-section. Fortunately for her, she was sophisticated. She knew to call a lawyer. That lawyer got in contact with the National Advocates for Pregnant Women, which has been an organization that has been stalwart in this space. But it's instances like that, and these are not isolated. These are not simply episodic. These are not anecdotal stories. These are across the country that we have seen this, and they've been magnified in the South. And I think that's really important to note. It's not exclusively of the South, but in the former Confederate states, the former slave states, we see the incredibly high disproportionate levels of death of women. We see sex education stripped from schools. We see high rates of STDs and out of wedlock births and so much more.
Okay, thank you. What can we do, like all of us as everyday journalists, to help spread this word? Because it is under the radar, and I want to get it out there.
It's under the radar. Well, first we have to appreciate women as full citizens and human beings, and that is a larger socio-political struggle still in the United States. I mean, even when you think about the recent June Medical v. Rousseau abortion case that went before the Supreme Court, they struck down a Louisiana law that infringed upon a woman's ability to control her own reproductive health and rights. But what I find incredibly saddening is that we don't turn to health and science, which explains so much, right? In history, for example, abortion was legal in the United States for centuries. Abortion became illegal as part of a platform by men who were coming into reproductive health as gynecologists and obstetricians, and they sought to push women out of gynecology. And the strategy to do so was to say, oh, they're performing these abortions. You know, it's that rhetoric that leads in part to where we are today, and a lot of racism around that, because this was around the time of the Civil War, and nearly 100% of women's reproductive health care was done by women, and about 50% of that was done by Black women. The professionalization of gynecology, which pushed out white women, Black women, indigenous women from this space, did not only that, but it was also anti-immigration. There was significant investment in platforms that were actually deeply racist and nationalist. And the history, you know, their writings say it all, right? So you don't have to read what I write, you know, you just read what Horatio Storer wrote and Joseph DeLee and Marion Sims, and it's all right there. Very racist, nationalist, white supremacist views that were anti-woman, essentially. And so as journalists, I think it's really important to connect to that. And I think it's also important to connect to the facts that surround reproductive health in the United States. We should not be proud that the United States ranks around 50th or 51st in the world in terms of maternal safety. We should not be proud of the fact that teenagers in the United States have the highest rates of STDs of any country in the developed world, and that in many countries that are developing countries, again with air quotes because of all of the politics around those framings, but we do far worse than countries that have been negatively described by our president, right? They're doing so much better with keeping women alive and helping them through their pregnancies, doing so much better with testing and screening of kids, doing so much better with regard to sex education. It's sad to know that in this country, 30 years ago, a child could go to school and be in middle school or high school and learn about their bodies. And today that simply doesn't happen.
And how do you, I saw that on your first, I was listening to your first podcast, and you were talking about Breonna Taylor.
Yes.
And so how can you talk about Black Lives Matter and what's going on now and the role of women?
Well, and this gets back to the point, and let me connect my last point with this, which is to say that we still operate in a legal system that presumes women's incompetence, their lack of intelligence, the inability to do certain things. So when we think about, let's say, abortion and medication abortion, which can be facilitated by 2 pills, there have been barriers put in place by legislators and by governors that suggest that women don't know how to take 2 pills on their own. You can't make that up, when in fact, no problem for a man to have a dialysis machine in his house and give himself dialysis 3 days a week for 4 hours at a time. And so what's sad is that it stares us right in the face. And so in the first episode of the podcast, it's lifting women out of this invisibility and out of the stereotype and stigma. And that is to say that people are protesting today regarding histories of institutionalized racism in our nation. And that's important to elevate those conversations. They come in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, who was suffocated, even really lynched, the way in which Officer Chauvin placed his knee on this man's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. That got people out into the streets. But what didn't get people out into the streets was the death of Breonna Taylor. And it says so much for these times because she was an essential worker and emergency medical technician. And she was shot numerous times in the middle of the night at her home in Kentucky by officers not in uniform who were at the wrong house while the person they were looking for was already in custody. Her death, that murder, was invisible to so many. The officers have been arrested in association with the murder of George Floyd. In her case, there are people who are still calling for accountability and for the officers involved to have their time in court too, and to be arrested and to have to face the public and the public scrutiny. And there are so many other cases that are just like this that Professor Kimberly Crenshaw has been lifting up for many years, the saying of "say her name," which is really important, which is to bring out of invisibility the lives of women who have suffered because of police violence. But let's be clear that it's not just police violence that's really important for us to think about, but it's systems of violence that harm women, that harm families, that harm their children, and that we as a country should be able to say, these things don't represent us. Whether it happens to a Black person, an Asian person, someone who's Latino, someone who's white, that we are better than that. And that is the point behind all of this, I think.
Hi, I just wanted to step in here. This is such a great conversation. We could go on for hours and people would learn, but I wanted to just check in. How much time do you have with us? And we'll take every minute we can get, but we wanted to just check in.
I think that we have a few more minutes and then it'll be that time.
I will just say that Professor Crenshaw has told me on our shows, she said that we should say her name, and because we talked also after the protest started, she said, make sure, I asked her, what can we do as allies to support the Black community? She said, say their name. And so we do that on this show. At the end of the show, we read the names of as many people as we can every single show for the last several weeks. So thank you for bringing up Professor Crenshaw as well.
That's great. And let's be clear too, the tragedies that have befallen Black transgender women as well, which also speaks to the homophobia that persists in our culture as well. You know, when we want a more just society that reflects the principles and values in our Constitution as an evolved, living document, then we must see really, you know, the value, not just in, you know, some people would say, well, you know, Black heterosexual life. No, you know, Black lives, including Black transgender women, and really a country that, you know, that wants to live to what it aspires in the documents that people often refer to.
Thank you, Rose. Let's go with a question from you.
Well, I'll just say something public. Sree, I think we should have a list of just say her names.
Sure, we could do that. And unfortunately, the list that we're using from Time Magazine is very short. So let's get the true list. If there is a list that we can use, I'd be honored to use it.
Okay.
That sounds great. And I think that we can be nimble and we can think about the space of time where we've been elevating in the space of police violence, but we could also extend beyond that. You know, thinking about the say her name of the Pauli Murrays, you know, of the Ida B. Wells and the Sojourner Truths and so many more that are lost to history, but gave us such important lessons, the Fannie Lou Hamers, and the list could go on, but they are critically important.
I think, you know, unfortunately, like we hear these names during Black History Month, you know, and then we don't.
And let me say too, Rose, if there's nothing else that people leave here tonight, but this is what I want to share. When one thinks about who we're given as the heroes and heroines to look up to. In the United States, they tend to be exclusively white men. There may be a couple of white women sprinkled. And the expectation is that no matter what your ethnic background is, you're supposed to say, yes, George Washington, yes, Thomas Jefferson, yes, and fill in the blank. And what's a tragedy is that we could all agree that Dr. King was an incredible humanitarian and visionary who made enormous sacrifices and who was very bright and a brilliant orator and so much more. He's never held up as an American hero or forefather. There's no school that describes him, this is your forefather, such that white kids say, there's my forefather, there's Dr. King, right next to George Washington. But imagine what the psychology of that does.
He's only on Black History Day that we celebrate him.
Well, and the point would be that in the mind of this child, that this child can say that, yes, though that person happens to be brown or Black, I can feel a deep inner connection in that way. And I think that that's pretty profound when you grow up and someone points out to you that that's a person that's connected to you, and not as in a kind of 10 feet away hero, but this is a hero that helps to shape the country that you live in and that you care about. I think there's something brilliant in that.
There is. I guess for me, one of my favorite authors is Toni Morrison. I think I've read every one of her books, and not that I have really experienced any of that, but they just stop your heart. And we've been fortunate enough to have Sapphire on the show, who was just a tremendous guest. And I think I think of all American writers that I can think of in recent history, I think Toni Morrison, she should be a foremother of literature for us.
Oh, absolutely, she is. I mean, when you begin to think about it, the people who shape canons, the people who help to shape thought, absolutely.
Right.
Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, and we could again go down the list.
And for poetry, all the movement, the people in the 60s have shaped American poetry. So we just have a lot to rewrite, Michele, right?
We do have a lot to rewrite. And here's what's important is that right now, people are coming, there's a kind of awakening to these things where people are wondering, oh, wow, yeah, why didn't I ever think about what that monument represented? And why didn't I know that these were not monuments of Confederates that were put up right after the Civil War? No, they were put up during Jim Crow, 50 years later. Why was that, right? And as people are beginning to think about these issues, then they should know that there was intentional efforts to make sure that there was the suppression of Asian thought, Black thought, Latino thought, Indigenous thought in the United States. Intentional effort to make sure that the writings of these brilliant folks were not widely distributed. And that's something hard for folks to digest. And, when you think about America of the free, of the brave, and all of that, it's hard to think that this was also a nation where people strategically designed to make sure that there were certain communities that would always be stereotyped in certain very negative kinds of ways. But now the silver lining is that people are beginning to understand that. And now we'll think, well, why didn't I hear about a Polly Murray? I know so much about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but there was Polly Murray before her who graduated also first in her class, who was also at the ACLU and did all of these amazing things. How come I know about one and I don't know about the other?
Terrific. And what can you say? I think I know you have a daughter.
Yes,
right?
That is correct.
And what do you say to her as far as what you want her to remember about this time?
Well, it's when she was a little girl, she's now working on a PhD and she's in Europe. But I wanted her to know about the past. The current was revealing itself, and we needed to be able to talk about it in nuanced types of ways to see the multiplicity of our world. And she traveled quite a bit with me. So in some of the places that we have our viewers and listeners are places that as a little girl, she traveled with me. But it was really important for me that she know about the past, and she know about, the African diaspora, but not just that. When she was a little girl, I bought her books about the Irish potato famine. I bought her books about the Holocaust. I bought her books about many different expressions of how people with an incredible spirit try to persevere against a lack of courage of others, right? When we see political oppression, social oppression, that really is a lack of courage, right? We know that bullies are not people who are very sophisticated and have true courage. This is what bullying is all about. And so it was really important for me that she grow up with a sense of being able to recognize humanity in herself and her culture, but also in others too, as critical and foundational. And since you asked, I'll also share that I spent a lot of time donating books to her school. And I would encourage other parents who are listening or tuning in to think about doing that as well. It's not enough that these are the books in our own personal home libraries, but it's also really important that we share with schools. And oftentimes I heard from her teachers that, oh, they just simply didn't know. Right. And they're teaching these kids, but they don't know these stories. And so it's really important.
That's terrific. I had a chance as a journalist to interview a Holocaust survivor. And one of my sons, who was in high school at the time, came with me to take photographs. And it was just incredible. She had the most, this woman was like, maybe she was 78, and she was swimming 5 times a day. She was playing tennis with people, 20 years younger than her. And she was talking, she hadn't talked about it for 40 years. Her children never knew this until she visited, the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington. And she suddenly said, not suddenly, but she thought, well, she should tell her story. And her motto that she always said to people was, step up,
yep.
be a hero, and hearing how she, went through 3 or 4 concentration camps and just the hunger, and she got out of a line in front of Goebbels. It's just incredible. And I think that it makes our experience, having those stories universal, like what you tried to do with your daughter. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you for doing that. I think that there's much to learn from that type of spirit. What keeps a person or a community whole? And when we think about it within the context of protests in the streets now and Black Lives Matter, you think about it, people who had to hold within themselves that they would not accept the stereotypes and the monikers placed on them. That when the United States said you're 3/5 of a person, or in the South where against tax time, you're 0 of a person, right? You're no different than a pig, a cow, a mule, etc. Holding within an understanding of your own humanity, even though for not just a year, not just a decade, but centuries, you would have people in this nation say, no, you are not a human. What does it take for a person to hold on to his or her own humanity and the humanity of others to say, I resist, I will persevere in my internal resistance of how you describe me because I understand my own humanity, and I will not be assuaged any differently about the humanity within. And I think that that's incredibly powerful, so much for us to learn from.
Well, it's terrific. It's such an honor to have you on, and I'm surprised you don't have your own TV show at this point.
Well, it's just so that I can be on with you, Rose, but for you, Sree, having me on this evening, and for your guests that have, your listeners that have tuned in from around the world. It's a pleasure to hear from so many of these different places and to think about my times in these spaces. So thank you very much.
Thank you again.
And we'll say thank you also for being here. We've got comments from all over the world. And after you leave, we're going to play that sizzle reel trailer for your podcast so that people can watch it. We thank you very much. Everyone, please follow Michele B. Goodwin on Twitter and check out our website, michelebgoodwin.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Rose, that was amazing. Thank you so much for working on that with us and getting us. Michele, what an amazing booking. A guest that shared so many topics and so much. We could have kept going on and on and on, but we had to let her get back to her evening out in California. For here, those of us on the East Coast, where our day is winding up, but there's still lots to be done in California. I do want to play the podcast again, so the sizzle reel, so people can make sure that they watch it. We have several people said they will subscribe, so I'm excited that we were able to do that. I'm just pulling up the ad here. So
she's quite active on Twitter.
Yeah.
I always look to see where she, what also she, the various webinars that she appears in. She will usually have a link, and I've signed up for some of, since I had interviewed her, and then her book came out, and I didn't know where she was gonna, I knew that she had many speaking engagements, but she's been able to do it through some webinars.
It's exciting. It's exciting. I also want to just remind everybody that you have a great newsletter, a great Medium post that you've written, so everyone should find that and read it, and check out #women2follow, so that first follow Rose Horowitz 31 and then follow Women to Follow, and that would be great. So let me play this trailer so that everyone can who missed it at the beginning, and then we will continue. We want to get
friends, join me for a new podcast on the issues with Michele Goodwin at Ms. Magazine. The time that we do it, we will be reclaiming our time. And I want you to join us for our first podcast on June 30th, 2020. You can find us at msmagazine.com, on Apple Podcast, on Spotify, and also on Stitcher. Join us for a podcast that you will not want to miss.
Oh, that looks great, doesn't it, Rose? That's
awesome. She's great. She's a natural.
She really is.
Brilliant. She's so brilliant, and she went from talking about criminalization of women and policing the womb, that subject, and she, to talking about humanity and the depth, the sort of the soul of where we find our humanity. So.
Yeah, and that is so important. And she was just a great guest for us, and we're very, very honored that she would spend that time with us, which is really.
Thanked us already on Twitter.
Yeah, you did. That's great. I'm glad you did, and we're grateful to everyone who joined us and was able to be with us for this. So, Rose, I'll let you get back to your evening.
Okay.
Thank you for 118 straight days. We've been here and doing one great podcast after another, a great episode after another. So, thanks to you and Vandana for making that happen. I really appreciate it. With that, I will say goodbye to Rose.
Okay.
And
good night, everyone.
We will thank our sponsors. But before we do that, as we do here every single day, as you heard Professor Goodwin say, we must say their names. And so we're going to do that tonight, as we do every night. And I'm just going to go in, and this is what we've been using to say their names. Rose raised the question of, should we be saying just her names once? And we can do that if someone provides us a list and can help us think through what is the right list of names to use. So here we're using the cover story of Time Magazine, Put Names Along the Border, and that's the list that we are using right now. And you're seeing here a photograph of a young George Floyd with his mother Larcinia, who would die 2 years before he would be killed, 2 years later, and almost to the day. And then they would be buried in Houston together. He, of course, was killed, as we saw on camera, in Minneapolis. And here's the list of names: Trayvon Martin, Yvette Smith, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Laquan McDonald, Tanisha Anderson, Akai Gurley, Tamir Rice, Jerame Reed, Natasha McKenna, Eric Harris, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, William Chapman, Sandra Bland, Darius Stewart, Samuel DuBose, Janet Wilson, Kaylin Rockmore, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, Joseph Mann, Terrence Crutcher, Chad Robertson, Jordan Edwards, Aaron Bailey, Stefan Clark, Danny Ray Thomas, Antoine Rose, Botham Jean, Tatiana Jefferson, Michael Dean, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. And to that list, we must add the name Rayshard Brooks, who was shot and killed on camera in Atlanta, and so many other people. So this is just a representative list, sadly, of all that has happened in the last few years. We also will say that we were asked by one of our previous guests on this show to talk about his elder brother, Ravi Budu, who was the elder brother of Ryan, who was our guest, who died in police custody after being arrested on a non-violent offense at the age of 32. And Ryan believes, as he wrote in a USA Today op-ed piece, you can see the link on the screen, bit.ly/Ryan op-ed, that his brother was a victim of police violence. And we are grateful to everyone who has watched. We are always looking for guest ideas, theme ideas. Please do email me, sree@sree.net. We're always looking for more ideas on how we can collaborate and get the word out on these shows and continue to bring you guests that are so meaningful to everybody as they're listening and learning together. We want to also thank our sponsors, as we always do, starting with globalentrepreneurshipexperience.org, 20% off with the code SREE, globalentrepreneurshipexperience.org, virtual teen camp that your teens anywhere in the world can go to. Please check out globalentrepreneurshipexperience.org. We also want to thank Fundamentals of Social Media, this course from Muckrack Academy that I was able to put together thanks to the resources of Muckrack. Free certification now available, mrac.co/social, mrac.co/social. And free certification, about 2 hours of work. You can do it in 2 hours or 2 days or 2 months. And please do sign up for it. People are sharing their certificates. It's so much fun to see that. We also want to tell you about a show that we have an ad for. We're going to play it right now. She's on Call. It's my honor to executive produce with two awesome surgeons this show. It's called She's on Call.
Hi, I'm Dr. Sujana Chandrasekhar. I'm an ear, nose, and throat surgeon in New York City and New Jersey.
And I'm Dr. Marina Kurian. I'm a general surgeon in New York City area.
We'd like to introduce you to our new show, She's on Call. We air live on social media platforms from 11 a.m. to noon every Sunday Eastern Time. We discuss the medical topics of the week.
We have two great guests, experts in their field, that help us analyze and look at some of the topical issues of healthcare. And we are on 11 to 12, so please join us.
We'd love to answer your questions, so please share and watch and send us your questions and comments.
See you Sundays at 11.
Please follow @She's on Call. They have fabulous guests every week. I learn a lot from that show. And many thanks to Dr. Sujana and Dr. Marina and our entire production team. And with that, we'll say goodbye. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for supporting us. We want to tell you about upcoming shows that we have, including a great show about Hamilton. And that's tomorrow at 9 p.m. Eastern, episode number 119. We're going to talk to Professor Lisa Tucker of Drexel's Klein School of Law. She's the author of Hamilton and the Law, reading today's most contentious legal issues through the hit musical. I think you will find that very timely and very interesting. That's on Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern. And on Thursday, we have another great show. We're going to be talking about various aspects of K through 12 education in the U.S. And we'd love to have you join us and learn about that on Thursday at 9 p.m. And then we're going to have a show that is a little unusual because it's going to be at noon Eastern time, and unusual because of the subject matter and where our guest is going to be coming in from. Ryan Kolotko is going to be coming to us, and we're going to be hearing his story. He, on May 29th, he gave a TV interview about police racism in the UK and his arrest the week before. On his way home from that interview, he was stopped and arrested again in a violent way, as you can see. Police smashed car window of man on way home from TV interview about police racism. As the Black Lives Matter movement sweeps the world, Ryan, a rapper of Indian origin in the UK, has decided to speak out about the discrimination faced by Blacks and other people of color in the UK. So please tune in Friday at noon for a most unusual and important show. And as always, we're looking for your guest ideas, speaker ideas, sponsor ideas. Please email me, Sree@Sree.net. We just love your feedback and love to hear what you are thinking and what you'd like to share with us. Lots of great comments coming in. And I see Rajan has tagged a bunch of people. And Radian says, thank you, Professor Goodwin. Thank you, Sree and your team. This was very enlightening. I came in late, so I'll catch the replay. Yes, everybody, please catch the replay and keep tagging your friends. That's the best way that we can learn. And Mark says we should also name those who were killed because of militarization. We had a 74-year-old grandma who was killed inadvertently by folks doing celebratory gunshots on July 4th. And thank you for everyone for joining us, says Rose. And Rose was terrific herself. And Radin says, apologies to those I gave a heads up late in the show. You can watch a replay of it and others in the series on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And just go to my YouTube/Sreenet. youtube.com/Sreenet. You can see our entire archives. And Apollo says, thank you, Sree. Love the replays and love all of you, including Apollo, for joining us. And Apollo, we want you on the show whenever you're ready to share and talk and be with us. We're most grateful to everyone. Thank you all, everybody.